In the summer of 1962, a 12-year-old boy in suburban Ohio spread a Dumas tugboat kit across his father's workbench and did not move for 3 days. Not because he had to, because he wanted to. The balsa ribs, the printed wood panels, the smell of model cement and fresh-cut lumber, the slow, patient satisfaction of building something that would actually float, something his hands had made from nothing. For nearly 80 years, a small company in Tucson, Arizona, kept that experience alive. While the world around it accelerated, faster boats, cheaper plastics, instant gratification in a box, Dumas products held the line. Patient craft against a culture that had stopped being patient. On June 5, 2026, the workshop went quiet for the last time. What happened to Dumas Boats was not an accident. It was a collision, and one side never had a chance. America in 1946 was the country that built things with its hands. The war had just ended. 16 million men came home from Europe and the Pacific carrying something the factories had given them. A fluency with machines, with tools, with the physical logic of how things fit together. They came back to a country that was ready to build, ready to consume, ready to dream in 3 dimensions. And in that moment, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, a man named Al Dumas had an idea simple enough to fit on a workbench. A model boat kit, balsa wood, printed panels, everything a man needed to build something that floated. The concept was not complicated, but the execution required a particular kind of belief. The belief that people wanted to make things, not just own them, that the process of building had its own value, that a Saturday afternoon spent hunched over a workbench, fitting ribs into a hull, sanding a deck until it was smooth enough to paint. That this was not a chore, it was the point. Al Dumas believed that. He built his first kits from balsa sheets, with the parts printed directly onto the wood. You cut them out, you sanded the edges, you followed the plans. No shortcuts, no pre-assembled components. The intelligence of the kit was in how the pieces fit together, and the builder's job was to understand why. The early kits were modest in size and enormous in ambition. Tugboats, cabin cruisers, working vessels that the men who built them recognized from the rivers and harbors of their own lives. These were not fantasy ships. They were American ships, the kind that moved coal up the Great Lakes, that pushed barges through the Mississippi Delta, that sat in the harbors of cities like Chicago and Cleveland and Baltimore, doing the quiet, essential work of a country that ran on waterways. That specificity mattered. Dumas was not building toys. It was building scale replicas of real American maritime life, and the men who bought the kits understood the difference. The company changed hands and addresses in the early years, a pattern common to small manufacturers navigating the post-war economy, before the Brandon family took over in the early 1960s and gave it something it had lacked: stability and a long-term vision. Under the Brandons, the kit line expanded. New boat designs came to market. The company acquired model airplane designs and began offering balsa aircraft kits alongside its nautical catalog, broadening its appeal without abandoning its identity. Through it all, the boats remained the soul of the operation. Around 1980, the company relocated to Tucson, Arizona, a long way from Milwaukee's lakefront, but close enough to the Western hobby market to matter. The workshop was modest, the staff was small, but the catalog was growing, and the company had earned a nickname that stuck for the next 4 decades: the Model Boat People. That name meant something. It meant that if you wanted a wooden PT boat that actually ran on water, a tugboat with working hardware, a Chris Craft replica built to the proportions of the real vessel, Dumas was the place. There was no real competitor in that space. Not for the kind of builder Dumas served. Not for the man who wanted to spend 60 hours on a project and feel every one of those hours as an investment, not a burden. By the 1980s, Dumas products had settled into a rhythm that felt from the inside like permanence. The kits shipped, the customers built. The company that Al Dumas had started on a workbench in post-war Milwaukee had become something rare in the American hobby industry. A specialist that owned its niche completely and served it with a consistency that generations of builders had come to rely on. For a while, that was more than enough. Picture a Saturday morning in 1987. A man in his late 30s, a machinist maybe, or a school teacher or a postal worker, drives to his local hobby shop somewhere in Middle America. He knows exactly what he is looking for. He has been thinking about it for 2 weeks, since the last time he finished a build and set it on the shelf next to the others. He walks past the plastic model kits, past the train sets, past the paint rack, and stops in front of the Dumas section. The boxes are long and flat, printed with photographs of finished boats on open water: the Lackawanna Tug, the Brooklyn, the PT-109, the 1947 Chris Craft utility with its mahogany-colored hull and its clean, classic lines. He picks one up, turns it over, reads the specifications on the back: 33 inches, radio control compatible, balsa and plywood construction, genuine marine hardware included. He buys it, he takes it home. And for the next several weekends, his garage becomes a workshop, and that workshop becomes the most focused he has felt all year. This was the world Dumas products served at its peak. Not a mass market, never a mass market. Something more valuable than that, a loyal one. The Dumas catalog in its prime years ran deep. Tugboats designed after real working vessels, Navy PT boats scaled to historically accurate dimensions, speedboats and cabin cruisers that evoked the golden era of American recreational boating, the post-war years when families bought runabouts and spent summers on lakes in Michigan and Minnesota and upstate New York. The kits were not cheap. They were not meant to be. They were priced as what they were: serious projects for serious builders. The construction process was the product. A Dumas kit arrived in a flat box containing balsa sheet stock, plywood formers, laser-cut components in later years, cast metal fittings, hardware bags, decals, and a set of plans drawn by people who had actually built the things themselves. The instructions were clear because the designers understood that clarity was a form of respect. Respect for the builder's time, for the builder's intelligence, for the seriousness of the undertaking. Building a Dumas tugboat properly could take 40 hours. Building it well could take 60. A man who finished one had something he could not have purchased anywhere at any price: the particular satisfaction of knowing that every plank, every fitting, every coat of paint had passed through his hands. That the boat on the pond on a Sunday afternoon was his in a way that no ready-made product ever could be. That experience created a loyalty that was, in marketing terms, almost impossible to manufacture. Dumas customers did not drift to competitors. There were no real competitors. They came back kit after kit, decade after decade, because the company had earned their trust one build at a time. Men who had bought their first Dumas kit in the 1960s were still buying them in the 1990s. They were buying them for their sons. In the best cases, for their grandsons. The community that formed around Dumas was quiet and serious and deeply American in its sensibility. These were not hobbyists who sought spectacle. They sought craft. They gathered at model boat clubs on weekend mornings, at reservoirs and park ponds and neighborhood lakes, and they put their boats in the water and watched them run. And they talked about construction techniques and hull designs and the particular challenge of getting a wooden boat to sit correctly at the waterline. They were passing something down. They did not think of it that way necessarily, but they were. At its peak, Dumas Products was the last name in American wooden boat kit manufacturing that still mattered at scale. The company had outlasted competitors, survived economic downturns, navigated the shift from purely static display kits to radio control compatible designs. It had done all of this while remaining, at its core, what it had always been: a small manufacturer that made something specific and made it well. The parking lot in Tucson never backed up for miles. The factory never ran 3 shifts. The Dumas story was never about industrial scale. It was about craft held steady for decades, in a country that was slowly forgetting what craft felt like. None of the men at the model pond that Sunday morning could have told you what was coming. The boats ran beautifully. The water was flat and still. Somebody's PT-109 cut a clean line across the reservoir, turned hard at the buoy, and came back the way it had gone out. Precise, balanced, exactly as the plans had intended. It was a perfect morning, the kind that feels, only in retrospect, like a goodbye. The first sign was not a crash. It never is. It was a gradual thinning, the kind that happens so slowly that the people inside the building convince themselves it is seasonal, cyclical, temporary. Hobby shop orders that used to come in at a certain volume started coming in slightly lighter. Reorder cycles that used to run on a reliable schedule started stretching. A retailer in Ohio who had carried the full Dumas line for 20 years quietly trimmed it to 6 titles, then 4, then 2. Nobody sent a memo. Nobody called a meeting. The market simply began to say, in its quiet and impersonal way, that something was changing. Through the 1990s, the warning signs were easy to rationalize. The economy moved in cycles. Hobby spending contracted during recessions and expanded during recoveries. A company that had survived for 50 years had earned the right to trust its own resilience. The Brandons had seen difficult years before. The kits were still selling. The catalog was still intact. The community was still there, still building, still showing up at the pond on Sunday mornings. But the pond was getting older. This was the fact that no one wanted to say out loud. The core Dumas customer was aging, and the generation behind him was not arriving in sufficient numbers to replace him. The 12-year-old who had spread a tugboat kit across his father's workbench in 1962 was now in his 40s, and his own son had grown up in a different world, a world of video games and instant entertainment, a world where 40 hours of patient labor on a wooden hull was not a weekend well spent, but a concept that required explanation. The hobby industry as a whole was feeling this pressure. Local hobby shops, the physical storefronts that had been Dumas Boats' primary distribution channel for decades, were beginning to close, not all at once, but steadily, one per year in small cities, 2 per year in medium ones. Each closure removed a place where a man could walk in, pick up a Dumas box, feel the weight of it, read the back panel, and decide on the spot to spend a Saturday in his garage. That spontaneous, tactile discovery was irreplaceable. The internet could list a Dumas kit. It could not recreate the moment of holding one. And then, in 2010, something arrived that changed the competitive landscape permanently. Traxxas, already the dominant name in ready-to-run RC cars and trucks, launched the Spartan, a deep V brushless raceboat capable of speeds over 50 miles per hour. It required no assembly, no plans, no balsa sheet stock, no 40-hour weekend commitment. You charged the battery, you put it in the water, and within minutes you were running a machine that performed at a level no wooden kit boat could match in raw speed. The Spartan was not aimed at the Dumas customer. The Traxxas customer and the Dumas customer were, by temperament and intention, almost entirely different people. But what the Spartan represented, and what the flood of RTR electric boats from ProBoat, Kyosho, and a growing roster of budget brands represented, was a fundamental redefinition of what RC boating meant in America. For a new generation of potential hobbyists, RC boating now meant speed, instant performance, and minimal barrier to entry. The idea of spending weeks building a hull before ever touching water was not a trade-off they were asked to consider. It was simply not part of their frame of reference. Dumas was not in the RTR market. It could not be. The company's entire identity, its entire value proposition, was the building process itself. To abandon the kit format would have been to abandon everything, but staying in the kit format meant competing for an audience that was shrinking on one end and not being replenished on the other. Inside the Tucson workshop, the decisions were practical and modest. Maintain the catalog, serve the existing community, keep the quality consistent. These were not the decisions of a company in denial. They were the decisions of a company that understood its own limits with clear eyes. But clarity is not the same as a solution. The orders kept coming, thinner each year, but steady. The community kept building, the kits kept shipping, and the gap between what Dumas represented and what the market was becoming kept widening, one brushless motor at a time. They called it a changing market. That was accurate. What they could not yet say was that the change was permanent, and that Dumas was on the wrong side of it. The 2010s did not arrive at Dumas products like a storm. They arrived like a tide, slow, constant, and indifferent to everything the company had built over 6 decades. The local hobby shop, which had been the lifeblood of specialty kit manufacturers since the post-war years, was dying in earnest now. Not struggling. Dying. The economics had become impossible. Commercial rent rising, foot traffic falling, online retailers undercutting on price with no inventory overhead, and no sales staff to pay. A shop that had anchored a strip mall in suburban Indianapolis for 30 years closed on a Tuesday afternoon with a handwritten sign in the window. Another one in suburban St. Louis followed 6 months later. In their place, big box sporting goods chains stocked Traxxas boats in blister packaging and nothing else. Amazon listed thousands of RC products and sorted them by customer rating and shipping speed, metrics that had nothing to do with craftsmanship and everything to do with convenience. For Dumas, each hobby shop closure was not just a lost account. It was a lost discovery point, one fewer place in America where someone could walk in cold and walk out with a wooden boat kit under his arm. The company had never built a meaningful direct-to-consumer presence strong enough to replace that distribution network. The website existed, orders came through it, but the spontaneous, in-store conversion, the moment that had recruited builders for 50 years, was evaporating, storefront by storefront across the country. The RTR electric market, meanwhile, was not slowing. It was accelerating. ProBoat, operating under the Horizon Hobby umbrella, with the marketing budget and distribution infrastructure that implied, was expanding its line year over year. Entry-level brushless boats dropped in price as Chinese manufacturing scaled. A 12-year-old in 2015 could receive an RTR speedboat capable of genuine performance for under $100, charged via USB, operable within minutes of opening the box. The barrier to entry had not been lowered. It had been effectively eliminated. Dumas could not follow that market. The cost structure of a small American manufacturer producing wooden kit products, real balsa, real hardware, real plans drafted by real designers, could not compete with offshore injection-molded RTR production on price, and it could not compete on immediacy by definition. The kit format required time. Time was what the new market had decided it did not have. The catalog began to contract. Titles that had been in production for decades were quietly retired, not with announcements, not with final run editions, but simply by no longer appearing in the next order cycle. The molds and designs accumulated in the Tucson facility, occupying space, representing investment that could no longer be justified by sales volume. Each discontinued title was a small death, largely unnoticed outside the tight community of builders who had relied on it. That community noticed. On model boat forums and hobbyist message boards, the regulars tracked the contractions with the quiet dread of people watching a familiar shoreline erode. A thread would appear. Has anyone heard anything about the Lackawanna restock? Another, called Dumas last week. Only 3 people still working there. The company responded to inquiries with courtesy and without drama. Orders shipped, quality held. But the silences between updates grew longer, and the longtime customers who had been building Dumas kits since the Nixon administration understood what long silences meant. The workforce shrank to a handful. According to hobbyist accounts, by the final years, the entire operation was being maintained by only a small crew. People who had stayed not because the economics justified it, but because they believed in what the company represented. That kind of loyalty has a cost. It sustains an institution longer than the market would otherwise allow, and it makes the ending, when it finally comes, more abrupt than the slow decline that preceded it. The broader hobby distribution infrastructure that Dumas had depended on was not coming back. The local shops were not reopening. The generation of builders who had discovered wooden boat kits through physical retail was aging out of the hobby, and their replacements, when they existed at all, were arriving through YouTube unboxing videos and Amazon search results, in a world where a Traxxas Spartan was 3 clicks away, and a Dumas tugboat required patience, skill, and a commitment to a process that the culture had stopped teaching. There was no single villain who walked into the Tucson workshop and turned off the lights. There was no hostile acquisition, no leveraged buyout, no executive who cashed out and left workers in the parking lot with cardboard boxes. What happened to Dumas was quieter and in some ways harder to reckon with, because there was no one to blame. There was only a market that had moved, a culture that had changed, and a company that had held its position with integrity and craft and absolute fidelity to what it had always been. And in the end, that fidelity was not enough. By the time the announcement came in the spring of 2026, the people who loved Dumas products were not shocked. They were not surprised. They were simply not ready, the way you are never quite ready even when you have seen it coming for years. The workshop was still running, the kits were still shipping, and then, with very little warning and a great deal of grace, it stopped. The announcement came in the spring of 2026, and it arrived the way Dumas Products had always conducted its business, without drama, without deflection, without any attempt to soften the reality with corporate language. The company was closing. After nearly 80 years, the docks were shutting down. Orders would be processed through mid-May, and then, on June 5th, 2026, the workshop would go quiet for the last time. The farewell statement posted to the company website was brief and, in its brevity, devastating. It did not cite market conditions. It did not reference competition or distribution challenges or the economics of small manufacturing in the 21st century. It spoke instead to the people who had built Dumas Boats, thanked them for their passion, their creativity, their love of the craft. It noted that the workshop was going quiet, but that the fleets the customers had built would keep sailing, and it closed with 4 words borrowed from the language of the sea: fair winds and following seas. 4 words, 80 years. A company that had known, from its first balsa kit in post-war Milwaukee to its last shipping day in Tucson, exactly who it was and exactly who it served, and chose, at the very end, to speak to those people in the only register that felt right. The model boat community received the news the way communities received the loss of something they had always assumed would outlast them. On the forums, the threads ran long. Men who had been building Dumas kits for 40 years wrote about the first kit they had ever purchased, the way the balsa smelled when you cut it, the particular satisfaction of watching a finished hull sit correctly at the waterline for the first time. They wrote about fathers and workbenches and Saturday mornings that were gone now twice over, gone when the fathers passed, and gone again now that the kits that had filled those mornings would no longer be made. Some posted photographs: a finished Lackawanna tug, painted in working vessel gray, sitting on a glass-smooth pond, a PT-109 mid-turn throwing a small wake, a Chris Craft replica with a mahogany finish hull, sitting on a shelf next to the plans it had been built from, the plans folded and refolded so many times the creases had worn through. These were not photographs of toys. They were photographs of time, of the particular kind of time that patient craft requires, and that nothing else can replicate. In Tucson, the final weeks looked the way final weeks always look in a small manufacturing operation: methodical, quiet, and tinged with a grief that nobody quite names out loud. The remaining crew processed the last orders. Kits that had been in inventory were packed and shipped. Hardware bags were counted and sealed. Plans were rolled and tubed. The work of closing is still work, and the people who do it bring to it the same care they brought to everything else, because that is the only way they know how to operate. The last kits left the building the way the first ones had arrived in hobby shops across America decades earlier, in flat boxes, carefully packed, with everything a builder needed inside: the balsa, the fittings, the plans, the implicit promise that if you followed the instructions and took your time, something real would emerge from the raw materials, something that floated, something you had made. There was no ceremony on June 5th, 2026, no gathering in the parking lot, no speeches. The doors of a small workshop in Tucson, Arizona, simply did not open that morning the way they had opened for the better part of 8 decades. The machinery that had cut and shaped and packaged wooden boat kits through the Eisenhower administration, through the moon landing, through the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the rise of the internet, and the arrival of the smartphone, that machinery was still. Somewhere in America that same morning, a man pulled a Dumas kit from a shelf in his garage, a kit he had bought years earlier and never gotten around to starting. He set it on his workbench, opened the box, unfolded the plans. The balsa still smelled the way balsa always smells: clean, faintly sweet, full of possibility. He did not yet know the company had closed. He would find out later, on a forum, in a thread that was already running to hundreds of replies. But in that moment, in that garage, with the plans spread flat and the morning light coming through the window, and the first pieces laid out in order on the workbench, in that moment, nothing had changed. The kit was still whole. The instructions were still clear. The process that Al Dumas had believed in back in Milwaukee, in 1946, when a country full of men who knew how to build things came home from the war looking for something to make, that process was still intact. It would just never be replenished. The workshop in Tucson was quiet now. The last fleet had sailed. The hobby shop on the east side of Columbus, Ohio, closed in 2019. The building is a nail salon now. The shelf where the Dumas boxes used to stand, long and flat, stacked 2 deep with the photographs of finished boats on the front, is gone. The men who used to stand in front of that shelf on Saturday mornings are still alive, most of them. They shop online now, when they shop at all. The spontaneous discovery, the moment of picking up a box and deciding on the spot to spend a weekend building something, that moment has no digital equivalent. It simply no longer exists. This is what the loss of Dumas products looks like from the outside. Not a headline, not a factory with 1,000 workers walking out into a parking lot. A shelf, an absence, a kind of discovery that will not happen again because there is nowhere left for it to happen. The kits that remain are in garages and spare bedrooms and climate-controlled hobby rooms across the country. Unbuilt kits bought years ago and saved. Built kits sitting on shelves next to the plans they came from. Half-finished hulls that may or may not ever be completed now that the company that made them is gone. On eBay and the specialty forums, the secondary market for Dumas kits moved immediately after the closure announcement. Prices climbed. Kits that had sold for $60 new were listing for double that within weeks. The community understood, without being told, that what had been available was now finite. The fate of the original Dumas designs, the tooling, the plans, the intellectual property that represented 8 decades of American maritime modeling, remained unclear in the weeks following closure. Whether those assets would be acquired, archived, or simply warehoused was a question the community was asking without an answer. It is the question that always matters most in these endings. Not whether the company survived, but whether the thing the company knew, the accumulated craft knowledge, the design library, the specific intelligence of how a wooden boat kit should be made, whether any of that survived with it. The model boat community that Dumas served for 80 years is still there, smaller now, older, more aware of its own fragility. The men at the pond on Sunday mornings still bring their boats, the Lackawanna tugs still run, the PT-109s still turn hard at the buoy and come back the way they went out. The boats that were built are still sailing, as the farewell statement promised they would be. But the line of succession is broken. The grandfather who taught his son, who taught his grandson, that chain required a company willing to make the kits available at every link. Dumas was that company for 3 generations of American builders. There is no obvious replacement. The RTR market serves a different need entirely. The wooden kit tradition in America has lost its last major commercial anchor. What Al Dumas started in Milwaukee in the years after the war, the belief that the process of building something was worth protecting, worth selling, worth sustaining across decades, outlasted almost everything that surrounded it. It outlasted competitors, economic downturns, the collapse of the local hobby shop network, the rise of video games, the arrival of the internet, the RTR revolution. It lasted in the end for nearly 80 years. That is not a failure. By almost any measure, that is an extraordinary run. But it is over now. The workshop in Tucson is quiet. The balsa will not be cut there again. And somewhere in America, on a pond that has no name in any official record, an old man is running a tugboat he built 30 years ago from a kit that no longer exists, made by a company that is gone, doing the thing he loves in the time he has left to love it. He is not thinking about any of this. He is watching the boat,